Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, hello. So today in the opening part of the talk, I'll have a brief introduction of our society, the Martlett Society, since we might have new people joining us. And then Xiao will introduce today's speaker, Professor Corkery, who will then share with us his exciting research as well, or his past, as well as about intellectual property. And this should last about 45 minutes to an hour, I think. And then after the talk, we'll have a quick 30-minute Q&A session. And so I just want to acknowledge everyone who's listed here for all of their efforts to make today happen in this talk. And there were different people involved in the planning, design, and promotion of this talk. And so quickly, I also want to say that the Martlett Society is an independent nonprofit organization for young scholars to build connections and have interdisciplinary exchanges. So we have the TMS talks, which is talks for academic research, as well as the WBA talks, which are talks for the world beyond academia, as well as TMS talks, which are workshops for more like skill set building. And then from season 2, we'll also have like special talks by people that were suggested by audience and members of the society. And so if you have any more questions, please visit the website that's listed below, or you can subscribe to the WeChat and Twitter channels using the QR codes in the corner. So yeah, if you have any questions, please let us know. And now Xiao can introduce Professor Corkery.
Okay, yeah, thanks Amnahir for the very nice introduction to our society. Now with great pleasure, I'd just like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Chris Corkery, who is currently a technology transfer manager for innovation and partnerships at McGill University. As a technology transfer manager, Chris' work focuses on translating McGill inventions into applications in society. Chris is also a project management professional, and he has experiences in 3 different startups. And he also helps McGill inventors decide how to best commercialize their inventions. So Dr. Corkery holds a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry and a Master of Science degree in polymer chemistry from the University of Manitoba and Winnipeg, respectively. So he got his PhD degree from Australia National University in organometallic chemistry and optical physics. After that, he came back to Canada and completed 2 postdocs at Western and McGill University, where he worked on thin films and brain-machine interfaces, respectively. Chris has also involved in the McGill spin-off that managed to put some technology on the International Space Station. So I came to know Chris as he helped me to solve some issues in my patent application. And I have to say, it's always a great pleasure speaking with Chris, and there's always so much to learn from Chris, not only from the perspective of patents or intellectual properties, but also his experience in and out of the world of academia. Now, without further ado, let me hand it over to Chris. Chris, the floor is all yours. Please share your screen.
All right, thank you so much, Xiao. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about intellectual property. I'm a technology transfer manager at McGill University, but I've also been asked to talk about how my career path arrived at becoming a technology transfer manager at McGill University, and all of the extra academic activities I had that helped me get to where I am. And I'd like to stress too that I really, really enjoy my job. I've looked at a variety of different jobs. I've been invited to be a professor, like a PI. I have been a CTO of a company. I've done a variety of things, and the thing that definitely fits me best right now, certainly, is this position as a technology transfer manager. And so part of the path of finding that might be important for people to understand, or helpful to people to understand. So the first part of today's talk will be career history, with a little touch on the education that I did, but Xiao went over that beautifully, and that's not really how one gets to where one is. That's simply a thread that binds things together. And it's the things that one does outside of that that actually help you find a position in the world and a position that you enjoy in the world. So everything that is volunteer work that I've done in that time, I'll highlight in green, either the title of the slide or the text. And then I'll also talk about the other employments I had, like that startup that I founded that didn't go very well, and then a startup that I was part of that I was the CTO of that put technology on the ISS. And then I'll probably not touch on another startup that we decided not to found. And then halfway through, I'll switch and I'll start talking about intellectual property. And there's an obvious change. I'll let you know when it's happening. And that's all sorts of information related to my job now that is useful for anyone who develops new knowledge and wants to find ways to not necessarily even protect it, but to make sure that it becomes available and used in the world. You know, as an academic, and I've done research for 20 years, it's pleasing and satisfying to discover something new and to be proud of it and to write a paper about it and it gets published in a good journal and you're pleased with your efforts. But that doesn't mean that someone in the world or some company or organization is actually going to take that wonderful knowledge that you've developed and use it. And that's an important aspect of any research that we do. It's no longer accepted in the world to do research that you don't tell people about, or to do research that is, oh, that's curiosity, but no one will ever use it and then discard it. People want to know what your research can do to help improve the society, the lives of people around us, advanced technology, all sorts of things like that. So that's what technology transfer, and technology transfer is what I do, is all about. Anyways, first we'll talk about my career. I normally start talking about my career by talking about graduate degrees. When you have enough degrees, people no longer care about where you went to high school. They no longer care about undergrad or things like that. But for a career path, I want to start by talking about my high school. I grew up in Winnipeg. I lived all my life there until I was 29. And it's in the exact center of North America, if you're ever looking for it. It's a wonderful place to live, and it's a place that very few people go and visit. And most people who are from Winnipeg are totally happy with that, because it is a fantastic place to live, and it doesn't really matter if not a lot of tourists show up. Anyways, I did an international baccalaureate full diploma. I was top of my class. I have always been quite good in school. And then I went to the University of Manitoba to do an undergrad, and it was the first time in 7 years that I was in a class that was with just the general population of students. And I hated it, and I did not do very well. I found it hard to go. I found the level of education I was receiving had taken several steps down. No offense, University of Manitoba. And I did not enjoy it. And I finished that undergraduate degree. I didn't even do an honors. I finished it with a GPA just above 3. And I was quite happy to not be involved in universities any longer, because it was not a very good experience. And so I went and found a salary job. And I had a salary, and I worked as a microbiologist, never having taken a class in microbiology in my life, or even biology in high school. And I worked for Apotex fermentation for a while, but that was not a fit for me. Being a technician simply didn't work. I wasn't interested in punching a clock and going in for an 8-hour shift, either in the afternoon or evening or daytime, and then going home happy that the fermenters were running and that I had done my job counting cells. So I decided to go back to school. And I went back to the University of Winnipeg, which is a smaller school. And I had to do an honors degree in order to be eligible to do graduate studies. So I did an honors degree, and I did polymer work. I learned some about polymer chemistry and making polymers, and making some of the very first actually biodegradable polymers is what imines do in polyimines. And then following that, I did a master's degree with more detail on polymers and polymers and their interaction with light. And I enjoyed it quite a bit. And I pulled my GPA up to a comfortable 4.0, which gave me the option to do what I wanted after that. I was invited to go to a few different universities. I have a super polite letter from one of the professors at MIT saying that we would love to have you in the lab, but I'm on sabbatical this year and can't accept students. Would you like to wait till next year? And I thought about it because it's a pretty good school, but I also got a letter from the Australian National University saying we have almost $100,000 in scholarships for you. Would you like to come? And I thought about it and said that I would. Anyways, separate from that, it's not the things that we do academically that shape us or our careers. Those are the core of things often, but it's the things that we do outside of that, like I said. And I've gotten involved in a variety of different pieces of volunteering and societies and organizations over the past couple of decades, and they are remarkably enriching. So at the University of Winnipeg, when I was a small child, I went and saw a chemistry outreach demonstration, and one of the professors there, a chemical engineer, I later learned actually, talked about how the dried pellet materials work in airbags to cause them to expand very quickly. And I was fascinated with that. And a group of students were coming in to have some experiments shown to them. And I was asked by the chair of the department if I would like to do that because I was good at explaining things in her words. And so I did some chemistry outreach and I enjoyed it. And in the end, I did every chemistry demonstration show that the University of Winnipeg put on for 2 years during my lives. I did a year of honors and 18 months of masters, and I did all the shows in that time. And then when I went to do my PhD in Australia, I continued doing chemistry outreach. That's a picture of a show that I did a show with Pete Wathers, who's a British chemist who's actually quite famous for doing outreach. And that's a picture of exactly what happens if you put a little bit of water on some burning oil. So never do that. When I got to Western, there wasn't an opportunity to do any outreach. There wasn't any, and I was only there for a year and a half. So I didn't do any, and I missed it terribly. And when I got to McGill, knowing that I'd be there for longer because my wife had been hired as faculty, I founded the chemistry outreach group at McGill. And so there in the lower left, you see me doing some demonstrations for the general public. We do big shows for Nuit Blanche every year. And last year, we won the Governor General's Prize, the Principal's Prize, sorry, for engaging the public and dealing with the public. And the group has done hundreds of demonstrations to tens of thousands of people since I founded it. And I've been part of it for that whole time, although I'm no longer in charge. And I love it. I find that sort of thing very rewarding. And it's caused me to meet a lot of people, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But as mentioned before, I went to Australia to do a PhD, and the PhD I did was actually a combination of chemistry and physics. I did a huge amount of optics work and optical nonlinearity, which is, simply put, it's when the reaction of a compound or an object or a substance changes depending on how bright the light interacting with it is, then that's a nonlinear optical process. And they're fascinating for optical computing and optical data storage and things like that. But it's very blue sky research. Quantum computing will be faster and better than optical computing. Optical computing will function in some different ways and for storage that quantum computing does not. And all of these are decades from application. And I'm more interested in technology that can be applied to the world in a shorter term. So when I left Australia, which was an excellent experience, I recommend doing at least one graduate degree or one postdoc in a country other than the country where you grew up in. It's enlightening and eye-opening to do something somewhere else in the world and see the difference in the way that people think in different countries. But after a short stint in Poland, where I helped some people set up high energy laser systems for a while, I came back to Canada and did a postdoc at Western. And I did a postdoc on hydrophilic and hydrophobic surfaces and the way that we can cause surfaces to interact differently with liquids, often to protect things, to make it so that we can coat boat hulls so that it takes them less energy to move across the water, or we can protect wind turbines from damage from ice, things like that. And that is my first experience in my life with patenting. So that was 12 years ago. And the work that I did there was deemed patentable by my supervisor, and we patented it and protected it. And 3M licensed that patent from us and kept it for many years. presumably using it. I think what they were using it for, well, I think they were using a technology of their own to protect wind turbines, but they didn't want other people to be using our technology, which is not ideal. But I was still happy that my technology got licensed. But importantly at Western, there's another thing that I did. I obtained a certificate in university teaching and learning, which is a year-long part-time program that I did during my postdoc. And I had always enjoyed teaching. I'd been a demonstrator at the University of Winnipeg and in the Australian National University and taught, and by that time I taught almost 1,000 students over the years how to do chemistry, how to do hands-on chemistry and be involved. And I taught occasional classes and one time a course, but I wanted to learn how to do this better. And there was this free certificate available at Western. And so I strengthened my teaching, and I disagree with the idea of obtaining pieces of paper to convince other people that you're good at doing things. But when you're looking for work or when you're looking to present yourself to people who don't know you, it's helpful to have those pieces of paper. So I obtained that certificate, and it has some standing and helped me get other work, as you'll see in the future. While I was at Western, and this is another piece of important volunteering, if you see by the green title, I joined the Postdoctoral Association at Western at the advice of a friend who was the chair of the Postdoctoral Association at Western, and I became the vice principal, I believe was the title. And one of the things that I did was work with the national organization, which was the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Scholars, and represent Western to the rest of Canada. And I did this work because having done a PhD in Australia, I was aware that postdocs in Australia got treated better. They were paid more, they were given better hours, they were given management of more things than postdocs in Canada. And as a postdoc in Canada, I was slightly disappointed in that, and I knew that better systems existed, and I wanted to help Canada understand this better system that could exist. And so in my time at Western, I presented those things several times at Western, and the conditions actually went up at Western for postdocs, which was great. And then when that finished, I was elected as the chair, the head of the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Scholars. And so I took over an already active, fairly strong institution or organization, and I worked to improve it. And we did a very large survey of all of the postdocs in Canada. That was the first time that had been done, and presented that information to universities. I helped CAPA, which is the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Administrators. So all of the administrators at different universities across Canada, they were founding their organization in that year. And so I helped them found that, and then created strong ties with that organization as well, which is important to this day. And I helped with government agencies and granting agencies and things like that in order for them to understand what postdocs liked about being postdocs in Canada and what they thought they would need to attract even better postdocs to Canada and to make them stay in Canada when they finished, which are important things to funding agencies. When I moved to McGill, which is coming on the next slide, I also was elected to be, I was still the chair of the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Scholars. And when that position finished, because it's a term, I declined to continue. And I did get elected the chair of the APF, which is the Association of Postdoctoral Fellows at McGill. And I was the chair of that organization for many years. And in that time, I was also the editor of the Postdoc Journal, which was a journal that was founded in 2012, my numbers are right, or maybe 11. And it's with the intention of highlighting postdoc specific research. And so I was not the editor in chief, I was one of the editors of that journal and did some editing and work, but it was useful to learn about journal editing. An important thing about these positions, I met dozens and dozens of university administrators, deans, provosts, presidents of universities. I became, I gained as colleagues people who were the head of the tri-agencies in Canada, people who were involved in the NIH in the States, and all across North America, some fairly well-known at the time names and still well-known now, people who I'm comfortable to call or send an email or get advice from, or sometimes they call me and ask me for advice about postdocs and how things have changed and how it should be. It led to several white papers on information about postdocs and a couple of peer-reviewed publications as well. And we see some of that here as a result of that survey that I originated and spearheaded. I spoke about that internationally. I was invited to conferences to speak. I was invited to university administrator conferences, which wasn't a thing I even knew existed before this, and met with all of those university administrators. And it helped a lot in terms of understanding how universities worked. My appreciation for universities in the world increased, and it made me several very useful contacts that I still have to this day. And then, as I mentioned earlier, my wife was offered a faculty position at McGill, so I politely turned down the faculty position I had been offered at a different university, and we moved to Montreal. And I did many things at Montreal, and many of them actually stemmed from my work as a postdoctoral representative as opposed to a researcher. But then I also was part of a CREATE grant that had position to pay 2 different postdoctoral scholars, and I was offered a postdoctoral position by someone who was going on sabbatical for a year and wanted me to manage his research group for a year, which sounded very interesting to me because that was a lot like being a PI. I'd done work like that before, and I wouldn't have to write grants. And we'll come to my feeling about writing grants in the future. But at this point in time, I also knew, particularly from some very good conversations with my postdoctoral supervisor at Western, that I was not very interested in being a PI. Didn't like the idea of having to hold a specific type of research and the ideas for that research at the forefront for decades. I didn't like the feeling that students who were working for me depended on grants that I would write. And I was a bit saddened by the idea that I would be entirely teaching and writing grants. And as time went by, I would almost never be allowed to go and do work in the lab anymore, because I was at a point in my life where I still was very excited to do work in a lab and to do the research myself with my own hands. So I was very happy with this position where I didn't have to write any grants. I got to look after a lab and manage some research projects and some students. And I had some of my own research projects that I did and found collaborators to do and worked with. And it was a wonderful experience. And then that supervisor came back, and I started working in a different lab because he wanted his lab back, which is understandable. And I started working in a different lab, making still making the same surfaces that I was making, but more on their application, using them to create true brain-machine interfaces. And that work was also patented. So I had another experience with writing a patent and how things get patented. There are many, many other things I did at McGill, because as I said, I didn't come to McGill with the intention of being a doctor. I came to McGill with the intention of finding an interesting position I wanted to do. So I used my certificate in teaching and learning from Western to teach courses on research project management, to teach workshops on how to do scientific communication, how to express ourselves after we've done this research that we want other people to know about. And I still do that to this day. I teach at least 2 courses a year. I taught a 3rd one this year about intellectual property, actually, but I still teach courses on research project management, how to find out what is, or to ask the right questions, to ask good research that will be impactful, or to do good research that will be impactful, and then how to delineate and make sure that as you do that research, you carefully direct it towards a publication, because that's the currency as researchers in the world right now. And then how to take that research that you've completed that should fit in a publication and publish it. And those are courses that I run every year, and I've done it for graduate students at McGill for many years now, and I enjoy it quite a lot. It also is a privilege to teach at McGill, and it is a privilege to teach graduate students. Undergraduate students are excellent and they're good learners, but they learn in a different way. And I love the back and forth interaction that one has when teaching graduate students. And I have been lucky enough, or through careful planning, I've managed to make it so that I get to choose what I teach and when I teach, and that is wonderful. So while doing that at McGill, I also did several volunteer things, as you see in the green below. I sat as a senator, so I was a member of the McGill Senate for a year, it was enlightening for me to see how universities work and how university senates work, and I was relieved when my tenure ended as a senator. Partly through my involvement in Senate and partly through my involvement with the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Scholars, I was introduced to the vice provost who was founding a group that he called Future of Universities, which was basically a think tank that looked at how McGill specifically needed to change over the next 15 or so years. This was 6 or 7 years ago. so that they could make sure that they maintain their position as a world leading university by 2030, because the world is changing fairly rapidly right now. And we need to be agile enough, all of us, people, institutions, everything needs to be agile enough to keep up, or we will fall behind. From that Future of Universities group, we have some white papers and information like that, but I also got the idea to set one up for chemistry. And I, for several years, sort of led a group in chemistry that helped chemistry graduate students figure out what skills they needed, extracurricular skills, sort of like what I'm talking about now, that would help them get the position they envision for themselves at the end of their master's degree or their PhD. And I'm happy to say that most of the members of that group are now doing exactly what they had hoped they would do. And they have all taken the time to sort of thank the group for helping lead them on the steps and do the other things that they hadn't realized might be necessary, but are useful things for us to do in order to achieve our goals. And I mentioned before about chemistry outreach, but I wrote, just before the pandemic began, I wrote a couple of different grants about what we're calling Chemistry for All. And our goal is, rather than just doing live chemistry shows, which I love and will continue doing all my life, but to also, for people who don't have access to that, to use some of this new technology that exists and create 3D content so that people can put on 3D glasses and look at the 3D videos on YouTube or in other places. And that's done with, we're doing that with help from the Office of Science and Society and Joe Schwartz. And that ideally will make some of the chemistry demonstrations that can be done that people can't always necessarily travel to and see or don't make it to feel much more like they're present, as opposed to simply watching it as a flat 2D video. We don't have any videos out yet because we got derailed a bit by the pandemic. Apparently one is not allowed to go and volunteer in a building that's closed, but it will come back as the world is getting a little bit better. Anyways, all of that has continued, on the previous slide, has continued at McGill since I started at McGill in 2011. But I finished my postdoc on brain-machine interfaces in 2014, and I left McGill, or I left permanent employment at McGill. I wanted to learn about startups. And there's a startup incubator in Montreal that does fairly well called Tandem Launch. And I worked at Tandem Launch for a 6-month stint, an entrepreneur in residence, getting trained on what's involved in starting up a company. And we looked at starting up a company. And as I was mentioning to Jen, I was actually working with someone who's upstairs from him. But we looked at starting up a company. In the end, we didn't. That company did not start up because we lost the technology where we were hoping to use as our core technology to start the company. And I'll talk about core technology and startups later when I'm talking about the IP section. But then I went and worked for a company called Sensorial, which I did not found. It had just been founded. I was their first employee. And I was actually, so 2 of us were hired at the same time. I was one of 2 first employees, to be fair to Alessandra. And Sensorial had a contract from the Canadian Space Agency and NASA and Honeywell Aerospace to make a device that does blood monitoring for astronauts on the International Space Station, so that we could actually do blood tests in space, as opposed to having to take samples of blood in space, hope that the samples don't deteriorate and bring them down to the ground, which was what the situation was even 3 and 4 years ago. And at that startup, we managed to be part of this consortium with Honeywell Aerospace and a couple of other small companies that created a device that does just that. And it now sits in a science lab on the International Space Station and is used to do experiments on astronauts' blood. And my experience on surfaces was part of what was important for this. I helped make surfaces for this autonomous system to work so that the microfluidic device inside could function. And my experience with lasers and optics was very important because everything inside that box that drives and does those measurements is stationary laser optics. And the layout and design for them were done by a colleague of mine at Honeywell Aerospace and myself. So there's some comfort that the things that I had learned how to do in life are applicable to the world or slightly off the world. But this sort of technology is also used and being used more now that it's been developed, is being used more for blood monitoring in situations where rapid responses are necessary and the availability of a medical lab is potentially difficult, either disaster regions or places in the third world. And that's heartening as well. During my time when I was working with Honeywell Aerospace, I worked with someone who was the project manager for the Canada Arm. And he told me about project management and the project management designation. And I mentioned before about certificates and how I don't particularly love them, but he told me that I had actually met all of the qualifications and had been doing project management for quite some time while working for Sensorial. And he suggested that I challenge the project management exam instead of taking the necessary courses and then doing it. And so I looked into it and looked at what was involved. And I took a bit of time off when I left Sensorial because my shares were bought out. And I obtained my project management professional certification, which is something that is actually quite valuable in terms of looking at guiding and leading larger projects. And I sit now as a project management professional, and it doesn't make a lot of difference to me in my current job, but I find it is actually quite useful in the courses I'm teaching, where I'm teaching about research projects and research project management. And as an aside, I learned this morning that my downstairs neighbor, who's been working to get her project management professional designation for the last 2 years, got it yesterday. So she's very happy about that. So congrats, Alex. Anyways, all of these things, hopefully I've managed to demonstrate to you that it's not simply the academic degrees that I did, but it's the things that I did outside of that, whether it's designations like this PMP or the course that I did at Western, or if it's all of the volunteering that's involved, whether it's the professional organization volunteering like the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Scholars, or the creation of volunteer organizations working to help do outreach for people. All of those allow you to gain skills that are valuable and usable, and meet people and make contacts that help you obtain positions, obtain what you want in life. I'm basically now doing a job that I love, and we'll get to that in this next section that's coming, but I'm allowed while doing that job to teach courses whenever I would like, so long as I also continue to do my job. I'm allowed to do all of the volunteering that I want. I maintain and help maintain several organizations. I still sit as an advisor to the Canadian Association of Postdoctoral Scholars. I still do live outreach presentations as often as I can. And I'm currently working to make these 3D videos that I'm excited to make as well. And all of those things enrich my life and stabilize my career. And so it's important to be aware that they're useful things to do. Anyways, that is also the first sort of half of this talk. I'm going to launch into intellectual property next and the job that I have currently, but now might be a good time, if you would like, to ask any questions about that first part. Are there any questions? Or do you want to save them for the end?
I think we can save the questions for the end, if you don't mind.
No problem. Then I'll move through this intellectual property section, and we can have questions about both sections as you wish, or discussion about both sections. So, as I've said, now I am my salaried position is as a technology transfer manager at McGill, and I work exclusively with intellectual property and the professors at McGill who create knowledge that they would like to see protected or translated or both into use in the world. And I mentioned before that I didn't love the idea of being a PI and having a specific focus to my research for a 20 or 30-year career, even if it branches into a couple of other things. That's never sat well with me. I'm always curious about the other things that are happening. And now I find that the job that I have, I enjoy incredibly, because a group of more than 50 professors at McGill that I work with always approach me and email me and say, I've had this wonderful discovery in my lab. What do you think of it? Do you understand how it works? And I have a diverse enough background, it's robust enough that I can understand what it is. And then I often will do a little bit of research to understand it better. And then I will help them decide, or decide for them if they're unsure, whether or not we should patent this, whether or not it can be patented. And more importantly, if it is protected in any way, or even if it's not, how we can then move that research into use in the world. I have, through all of the different things that I've done, I have many, many contacts in industry and in different research at universities and things like that. And I use those happily to help these professors migrate their technology into the world. And I really love my job. I remember talking to my father once, many, many years ago, and he has always told me that he loved his job. He was a survey geologist before he retired. And he said to me, you know, Chris, if I were to win like a lottery and a big amount of money, I do love my job, but I would quit tomorrow. And that surprised me at the time, because all of my life growing up, I was in my 20s at the time, I understood that he loved his job. And I have a job now that is not, there are parts of it that are frustrating. There are parts of it that are tricky or difficult to do or require care. But I'm aware that if I won a big amount of money, it would have to be a huge amount of money right now to make me want to leave my job, because I would need to do something else. We need to be challenged in life. We need things that are not easy to do as we move forward in life to be happy. And this job that I found is most definitely the work that I found in my life that makes me happy the easiest. I have been doing this for a long time, and I have yet to have even a week of work where I had trouble starting that week saying, oh, this is going to be a hard week of work. I wish I didn't have to work this week. It doesn't happen. And that's awesome, because I've done lots of other things in my life where, going in each day that week was particularly difficult or frustrating. And this job I enjoy so much that does not come up. And that's excellent. And so that's the sort of thing that I advise everyone to sort of look for as you try and figure out what it is that you want to do in the world, what you want to use your education to guide you towards. So here we'll talk about intellectual property and how we protect it, the different ways that it gets protected. And this is some work that I did with Xiao is what led to this talk and this role. So intellectual property is any product of human intellect that is novel, non-obvious, and valuable, and technically unique, but that's got a bit of a gray area to it. Anyways, that can be everything from a piece of art, new way to make a transistor, which I helped patent last year actually, and they're very good. You'll hear about them in the future one day, I expect. And it can be a design, a different way to lay out the roads in a city to improve flow. It can be an improved style of chemistry that causes chemical reactions to happen more quickly or more cheaply. It can be a better way to do waste management in a city, any number of things. It can be a book. It can be anything that you write. Every time you write a piece of work, it is unique, it is novel. No one else has written that exact work unless you've plagiarized it, which you should never do. And it's ideally valuable. And so that is then intellectual property, and it's your own intellectual property. There are a variety of different types of intellectual property. There are patents, the idea of patents, which everyone's familiar with, and we'll get into that. Copyright as well. Trademarks. I don't know if you noticed when I had the logo up for the PMP, there was a little R in a circle. That's a registered trademark, which means that the Project Management Institute has paid to register that logo as a trademark. Most logos are paid for. The McGill logo you see at the bottom of this is a registered trademark. It simply doesn't come with a small R on it, but it is registered and protected. And then there's other types of intellectual property, trade secrets like the Coke recipe, plant breeders' rights like the exact genetic composition of the best way to grow rice or the best way to grow peas, and on and on. Everything that is grown and all of the things that are food are someone designed and developed in this day and age, designed and developed that type of food. And for a time they had plant breeders' rights. Know-how is the experience of all of the people in an organization and how that combines to allow that organization to be skilled and valuable. If you found a startup, if you ever hope to exit it, which you should do with most technology-based startups, part of what you will be selling when you exit is the know-how of all of the employees who will stay with the company, presumably on exit. And then design registrations, like laying out a steam engine that is a steam engine that transfers heat a little bit better. You could patent that, but you can also register that design, and it's much cheaper to do and can sometimes be valuable. So all of those are intellectual property. I'm really only going to deal with the main types today. So we'll talk about patents and copyright, and I've already spoken a bit about registered trademarks or trademarks. So copyright is your exclusive right to something that you have created. Usually works of art are copyrighted, but it can also be, importantly, software code. That's copyrighted. And in Canada, and I realize I'm speaking to an international audience, so you need to look at the way that it's treated in your country, because all patent or all IP protection is country specific, although the World International Patent Office governs how patents work worldwide, and then the countries make their own decisions within the country, so long as they fit within the WIPO. But copyright is automatically given to the creator of a copyrightable work. So if you were to go and draw a beautiful portrait tomorrow, Jen, it is, if you do it in Canada, it's copyrighted. You own that copyright. I'm not certain about what the rules are in Germany, but I know how to look them up. And you would be recognized as the creator of that work, and no one else could use it without your approval. And your approval might include them paying you for your artistic skills or things like that. That's how copyright works. If Amnahir were to go and write the Great American Novel, then that Great American Novel is in the US, actually, it is also copyrighted. It's owned by you when you write it, Amnahir. So it would be as you write it, even, it's copyrighted by you. However, if we're concerned about something, we can also register that copyright for a nominal fee. You can go and talk to the patent office or the copyright office, technically, in the country that you're in, and you can register that work as yours and copyright it as yours. And then that registered copyright is potentially valuable sometimes to artists or organizations, because then you can sell it. You can prove that someone else has the rights to use this excellent drawing you made in their media campaign or things like that. Copyright is different from patents in that patents explain to us a new way to do something, or a new type of material, a new object. There's a few different varieties of patents, but most patents are utility patents. And a utility patent is a composition of matter. This is a new surface that Chris has invented when he was doing brain-machine interface work that allows neurons from people's brain to grow to the surface and attach to it, and enhances neural communication and brain-machine interfaces. And so I have that patent. We patented that provisionally, but then have since let it go as there's better technology that's been developed that I actually helped patent in a patent that got submitted 2 days ago on my father's birthday. Happy birthday, Dad. And those ideas can be protected by patent. And that means that you have the right as the owner of that patent to legally order someone else in the jurisdiction that you have it patented to cease and desist producing, manufacturing, or selling that product in that location. Companies use this to act as a starting point to help them develop a product to move it out into the world. The reason that the patent system was developed more than 100 years ago now was because every company and organization was its own little island, and they were doing their very best to develop technology all by themselves so that they could have a product that people would like to buy. And there are two sort of avenues of thinking as to what patents would do. One problem that was occurring is people were taking these products that were purchased and reverse engineering them and then trying to make their own and then selling them. And that made the company that developed it uncomfortable because their ideas were being stolen. And then the other intention of patents is to make it so that when ideas are had, whether at universities or in companies, they can be patented, but the patent has to be made public. And still to this day, patents have to be made public. So if you have an idea, you can claim it as yours, but you can broadcast it to the world so that the rest of the world can use that idea and build with it. And it's dramatically accelerated the rate of knowledge creation in the world. It's also worked well to make some organizations very rich by keeping things to themselves. And so it solved both of these problems, and some companies got richer and the rate of technology development in the world increased. And while I don't love the fact that some specific companies are getting richer, arguably at the expense of others, I wholeheartedly embrace the idea that the rate of advancement of technology in our civilization is increased because of the patenting system. And it's not a perfect system. I will be the first person to tell you that, but it's definitely a system that did some of the things that it was intended to do when it was laid out. And with some changes, I think will still continue to be an excellent system in the world. Anyways, I think we've sort of gone over what the difference between copywriting versus patenting is, but copywriting protects a specific thing. Patenting protects the idea of creating that specific thing and the instructions on how to create it. And actually a good example is software. Recently, an inventor that I work with created some software that helps AI determine whether or not that cell is healthy or not when it's trying to do assessments for oncology, looking at cancers or things like that. And the idea of doing that is now patented and protected, and that can be done, and it's excellent how it works. But as well, some software was written to demonstrate how that idea works, and that software got put in the patent as a proof of principle, a demonstration that the idea was patentable. And then the software itself is copyrighted because that software can then be used and sold to use this idea. Of course, because they also hold the patent to this idea, then there's no concern about someone else having that idea, for what that's worth. Interestingly, when we look at ideas, we have to, if we want to patent them, we also now have to reduce them to practice. I can't just have an idea for, as a professor that I worked with the other day said, I found a lovely way to turn dimes into diamonds. It's great. He can't patent that unless he can actually make it happen once and show that it's happened. And since he's a researcher in oligonucleotides, I don't think he's actually ever going to do that. But it's a demonstration of how we can't patent something unless we can demonstrate that it works at least once. So as we look at patents, let's talk a little bit about the life cycle of a patent. There's a variety of different types of things that happen in what would be called a patent family. Initially, we have the idea, and before we have even reduced it to practice, we're allowed to file a provisional patent, this priority application that you see over here. That gives us a priority date stating we had the idea before anyone else. If someone else can be found later to have had the idea earlier, then your patent is in fact garbage. But that gives you a priority date, and that's important. At the end of that provisional time, you have to have reduced it to practice. You have to have successfully turned your dimes into diamonds, or you're lost. And that provisional patent lasts for 12 months. And at that point in time, you have a choice. You can either file a PCT with the World International Patent Office and gain 18 or 19 months of protection worldwide, or you can skip the international phase and go right to a national phase and file patent protection in whatever countries or jurisdictions you wish to file patent protection in. So a PCT is an extra $10,000 to $15,000 in cost, but it gets you an international search report and a written opinion of the International Search Committee and things like that. And that helps you understand where you should patent your idea, how good your idea is, and what jurisdictions will have trouble with some of the claims in the patent and what jurisdictions will be happy with it. It's guidance to how to file something in the national region. And if you're a startup, it also buys you time, because filing nationally here on the right in the gray costs between $10,000 and $40,000, depending on what translation you need and what jurisdiction you're filing in. So if you want to protect it in 5 different countries, you might be looking at $150,000 or $100,000. Whereas if you want to file it a PCT internationally, you're only looking at $15,000. Doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things for a large company or a company that knows exactly where they want to use it. But if you're a small startup and this is your core patent, not having to spend $100,000 for the next year and a half is a big deal. And so then you would file a PCT, and then you would use that time to get enough funding to actually do the national conversions later on. And then once these national conversions are done, you do not hold a patent, you hold a patent application. And for this whole time, you've had a patent pending status. In each country individually, over time, a patent examiner will look at that patent and determine if there is any prior art. If anyone has ever had the idea before you, if your reduction to practice is actually sufficient and acceptable, and determine whether or not individually each of the claims you've made in your patent is to be awarded or not. If they're to be awarded, great, then they get awarded. If they're not, then you can argue with most jurisdictions over and over and over at your own expense until you're either convinced that you no longer have any money and should stop trying, or you change the minds of the patent examiner and the patent office. In my experience, it's actually worth having the patent examiners come back one time and say, you can't get all of these claims, you can just get these claims, because that tells you that you applied for as many things as you should. If I were, say I were in Morocco haggling with someone over a rug that I'd like to buy, and I'm like, oh, well, I'll give you the equivalent of $200 American for it. And they say, yes. I'm like, oh, I wonder if I should have maybe offered a little bit less in my first offer. Oops. The same thing sort of applies with the way we file patents. You want to claim as much as you can to make sure that you get as many claims and have as strong and robust a patent as possible. So if you make some claims and the patent examiner looks at it and says, sure, all those are granted, you're going to look at yourself or your patent agent and say, should I maybe have made a few more claims just to make sure that I could get everything I could? And so it's not bad to have the patent examiner come back and say, not all of these claims are legitimate, because then you know that you're going to be able to get as much as you can. But you don't want them to come back and say, none of these claims are legitimate because the paper that someone published 3 years before your priority date invalidates all of your novelty, or sorry, your non-obviousness. Someone has already thought of this idea, sorry. You can't turn pennies into diamonds. Someone thought of that at McGill and told me about it the other day, and I have publicly disclosed that to the world in this talk. All right, and the reason that we want to be careful with where we file patents and make sure we do things is that a patent is expensive. Like I mentioned before, some of those costs. If you want to protect something for 20 years, which is the lifetime of a patent from its priority date until when it expires, you're looking at between 100 and 200K, depending on how many regions in the world you want to protect it in, how hard you decide you want to fight the patent office in each country individually for some of those claims, and then issuance fees and maintenance fees and things like that. So with that in mind, most companies, most organizations patent selectively. You don't need to spend $200,000 to have an idea protected. If you're only going to manufacture it in Canada and sell it in Europe and the States, then you only need protection in Canada and Europe and the US. If you're only ever going to sell it in the US or Europe, you don't even need protection in Canada because you're only selling it in the US and Europe. And then another thing to look at is if you're also plan to sell it in India, but the Indian patent situation, well, India is a big market. Let's not use it as an example. Let's say if you're only going to use it in Senegal for some reason. Senegal has a patent office, I think, but the size of the market probably does not make it worthwhile in terms of profits to patent it in Senegal when I could patent it in Canada. I'm making it in Canada. It can only be made in Canada for whatever reason. And then I'm selling it in Senegal. Who's going to infringe on my market, right? You need enough protection to make it so that it's not a large financial loss for you to not have protection in another jurisdiction. You know, if it's something that is made in China and sold in the US, I only need protection in either China or the US to keep it safe, so long as it's not being sold somewhere else or made somewhere else. If I want to get something ironclad, then I just get protection in China where it's made and protection in the US. And then some company can look at whether or not it can be made in Australia and sold in Mexico. And if they make a huge number of profits on that, I made a mistake. I probably should have protected it somewhere else. But if they aren't making very much profit, then I don't really need to worry about it because my main market is in the US and my main manufacturer is in China. Great. So once you have a patent, you want to translate it into the world. You want to license that patent, or you want to found a startup with that patent and start selling the product that you have invented on your own. A license is basically a contract, an agreement between the assignee, the owner of the patent, whomever that is. Initially, it's the inventors, or if you're at a research institution, it's probably part of your contract as a research at that institution is that the owner is the research institution. If you're at a company, part of your contract and your job is probably that the owner is the company. But either way, the inventors are locked in, and then it's assigned to someone, and they can assign it to someone else if they wish, sell basically, or they can keep a hold of it and license it, which basically means it's still mine, but I'm letting you use it. And so a contract can get set up, and I set up contracts like that, and the terms on these contracts are any number of things. They can be ridiculously long and complicated. They can be as simple as 2% of our profits for all time will go to you because you invented this. And it's whatever you, the assignee or inventors, want to set up with the person that you're licensing it to. A common thing that people ask me about is the difference between an exclusive or a non-exclusive license. If I invent a better knife for cutting turkey, I don't know how this knife works, but that's fine. It's better at carving turkey than the currently existing knives. And I know that people don't really eat turkey in Australia, which I was surprised to learn when I did my PhD there, but turkey was very hard for me to find. Anyways, so I'm not too worried about trying to sell it in Australia. So I decide to exclusively license it to a company in North America, or Canada and North America, and they'll sell it for people who want to carve up their turkeys for Thanksgiving. Problem solved. However, I might discover that they eat a lot of lamb in Australia, which they do. And so this knife that's good for carving turkey happens to also be good for carving lamb. So I can non-exclusively license it to North America for carving turkey and to Australia and New Zealand for carving lamb. It's the same knife, it does the same thing, but I've licensed it in 2 different locations. And the company that I license it to in North America only has the rights to use my knife and sell it in North America. And the companies that I license it to in Australia and New Zealand aren't allowed to sell their knife in North America because someone else has that license. So that would be an example of 2 non-exclusive licenses. The other option is I exclusively license it to the company in North America, and they sub-license it to a company in Australia or New Zealand for carving lamb. If someone has an exclusive license on something, they can then sub-license that to someone else. But if they have a non-exclusive license, they're not allowed to let someone else use it. So exclusive licenses basically mean this company is allowed to use every part of this patent wherever they want. A non-exclusive license says you can use this patent to help you gut crayfish in the Florida Keys, but nowhere else. And it's a very tight little exclusive license, and they only pay you $200 a year for it, but they only sell 6 knives a year, and they still make a profit. Everybody's happy, optimistically. So that's licensing and translation. And an important thing we think about when we license technology is that does not mean that it's fire and forget. You license a technology, you're still the owner of it, but the company you're working with has a contract to use it, and you can't just cancel that contract at any time. It's a contract. They're allowed to keep using it. So you want to maintain a relationship with them. You want to show them that I've actually invented a knife that slightly improves the way that it cuts lamb, for example. So you might want this improvement from me, and I'll give it to you at very little money because I couldn't actually patent it, because the patent that I've already licensed to you really basically covers that knife, but this little extra notch at the end here means people will be happier when they're cutting lamb. For a small additional licensing fee, this notch is yours as well. And then if you've got good relations with that company, that's great. If you don't, then you might not be able to adjust the license in the way that you would like. The other thing that's important when you're looking at licensing technology or founding a startup is what technology readiness level it's at. And technology readiness level is defined by different countries and different organizations in different ways, but this is a good one for academic technology readiness. In order to reduce something to practice, you need this experimental proof of concept or validation in the lab. Remember, we talked about you can file a provisional with just the idea, but you can't actually patent it unless you reduce it to practice, demonstrate that those dimes are now diamonds. And so that's that validation. And then with this basic validation, large companies are often not interested in licensing that. They want to see a startup, these days at least, they want to see a startup take that technology and make it more applicable. This is what I did with the Canadian Space, or for the Canadian Space Agency, when it was with the company that made stuff for the space agency, with space agencies, NASA and CSA and ESA as well. We took the experimental proofs of concept. It was actually maybe TRL4 when we started, and we moved it up to a TRL6 or 7 system that's now in use on the ISS. In the same way, if a company were looking to acquire us, they would like to see a startup take an early technology readiness level company and raise that technology readiness level up to something that they would then be happy to buy. And then they'll, rather than invest a few $1 million over 5 years, they'll pay $30 million in 10 years to buy the company, the startup that decided or demonstrated how this technology could work and moved it up from technology readiness level 4 to 8. And so with that in mind, you might want, when you have an invention, you might discuss it with your tech transfer professionals, but it might be a good idea to consider founding a startup and raise the technology readiness level yourself, because let's be honest, no one knows that technology better than you do. And so you found a tech-based startup, you take that technology as your core technology, and you build it up, you build up the technology readiness level to a point where you're ready to sell that company. And along the way, you make many contacts with that company, the company you'd like to sell to, or a couple of different companies if you hope that they'll bid against each other. And you protect the additional information, additional technology readiness levels with their own patents that are sort of blanket patents, which I'll get to in the next slides, that protect that core idea that you've had. So as you go, you decide what to patent. You decide whether or not it's necessary to patent, and you reserve the money for your startup specifically. And you make decisions about what you can patent and what you should patent based on the funds you have and based on the companies that you hope to exit your startup to's requests. That's why you work with them. They want certain things, and you need to work with them to make sure that you're going in that direction. And what you need to do is create a patent portfolio, because when that company acquires your hypothetical startup, they're buying three things. They're buying your patent portfolio, they're buying your customer base, and they're buying the know-how of you and all of the employees in your startup. So the know-how is there because you built it up. The patent portfolio you have to build carefully. And the customer base is something that you're trying to create over time to demonstrate the validity and value of this idea that you've had. So you've got your core technology that we talked about. You've got blanket patents, which are other patents that you develop over time as you increase the technology and readiness level. And you occasionally would file what's called a picket fence patent, which is a patent that you're not really going to use, but you're going to retain to keep others from being able to sort of infringe on your core technology. This, remember I mentioned that 3M didn't actually use my invention, to my disgruntledness. What they did is they licensed it from Western, and to the best of my knowledge, they used it as a picket fence patent to keep other people from actually infringing on the invention that they had at 3M, which is frustrating because it means that Western and I did not ever receive any money from that patent. 3M held it for quite a lot of time, but they have since let it go, and a different company has now picked it up. So hopefully they'll build up that technology and use it, and I'll see this invention of mine used in the world. And a thing to be aware of about patents is it's very expensive. So in general, do not file them unless you need them. And you need them if someone else is going to be able to do what your company does, and you can't stop them if you don't file it, or a company or companies that you're hoping to sell your startup to wants you to have that protection. In the long grand scheme of things, they'll eventually be paying. The last slide that I have for today is about disclosure. Remember, I talked about how if someone has had this idea and made it publicly known, made it obvious, you cannot patent it. That's important. I mentioned before, I've now talked in this conversation about turning dimes into diamonds. That is not so much of a disclosure because there's no actual information on how that might be done. But if I had a realistic idea on how that could be done, and I describe it in a conversation like this that will go on YouTube, or if I present it in a research presentation, or I publish it in a paper, then I've publicly disclosed that, and it's obvious, and I cannot patent it. Interestingly and importantly, for those of you who are doing work that might involve, or research that might involve IP that would want to be protected, if in the conclusion section of your manuscript, you suggest some future work that would enable this exciting advance in technology, you have made that exciting advance obvious. And it might be that your own conclusion section in a manuscript makes the work you do 2 years down the road unpatentable. So be careful when you make those concluding statements in manuscripts. It's possible, if what you're doing could work so well that you would want to patent it and sell it to the world, maybe leave that concluding statement out, just in case. However, there are lots of ways to protect things. If you have a contract between you and the people that you disclose something to, if you have non-disclosure agreements between you and the members of the audience who are attending, if you all work at the same institution, then you're not actually disclosing something when you discuss it. So please, as you think about whether or not you're generating IP you would like to patent, determine whether or not you should maybe not present that poster at a conference, or don't publish this paper until you've talked to a patent agent about whether or not it should be protected first before it's published. And it's not to say, and this is an incredibly important thing, it's not to say that you have to protect everything In fact, it's expensive. Don't protect every idea that you have. As a researcher, there are lots of different ideas I had. The ones in Australia about the blue sky research, about how optical computing could work and things like that. Those were not patented by us, and we didn't want them to be. We want that to be public knowledge so that researchers can continue to build and develop these ideas that are valuable. So you don't have to patent things in order to have them be valuable and have them get out in the world. If the development of something should move into industry and you're looking to have that development continue, but it will require a large amount of funds, say you need, for example, to develop vaccines against COVID. That requires a huge amount of clinical trials. Those clinical trials cost many, many millions of dollars, and that's very hard to come across at a university to test a specific single drug. So what you do is you patent that drug that you've developed, you license it to a company who has those many millions of dollars and is interested in doing that clinical trial, and then they do the clinical trial. That's a time when a patent is useful. There are those also, and this is important, again, who would argue that you should do what Banting did, and you should just make how to do that publicly known so that no one can ever patent it. Make it obvious, make it free and available to the world, and make sure that as many people in the world have access to it. And that's perfectly valuable and perfectly valid as a choice for the way to do things as we do research as well. Publish your papers, make sure that everyone in the world knows, make sure that no one can patent it, and move on. The only thing you need to do before you do that is make sure that some drug company doesn't take your paper, pick up a way to slightly improve the manufacturing or production of that, patent the manufacturing or production, and then they withhold it from the world in that manner. Part of why I like patents is it gives you the control to decide whether or not someone is allowed to use this. A good example is actually NASA patents things like improved flight paths to the moon, and then immediately publishes them and announces that they're never going to prosecute. Tesla did that with some of their patents for the electric cars. They showed them to the world and said, we're not going to prosecute these. We want everyone in the world we want the world to be a greener place. Take these patents and use them to build whatever cool cars you can. But they still have those patents, which means if some company in India decides to start selling electric cars based on technology that they developed from Tesla's patents, and doesn't want people to freely use them and starts to try and hide things, Tesla can say, oh, well, because you're using our patents, we actually do have the right to sue you. Are you sure you don't want to make those open and available to the public? And so that's the way that you can use a patent to make sure that information is actually free flowing as well, assuming you have the financial resources to do so. All right, so that is the end of what I have to say today. Do we have any questions? Are there any things we'd like to discuss? I'll stop sharing my screen, or unless you have questions about specific slides.
All right. Thank you, Chris, for the excellent talk. It's really very informative. And let's see if there's any questions in the QA section. I don't see any. Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, there's a question. So would you like to promote into the panelist so that he or she could speak up, or Yimbai, would you like to speak up, or?
Okay.
Perfect.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, clearly.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for sharing. I'm interested in your past experience. So I would like to ask, while you were working, like how much time approximately did you spend on like taking the PMP certificate, and how do you find this experience?
So time is the currency we have that never comes back. That's why, if you notice, there are several different volunteering things that I did, and the ones that I showed you and highlighted are the volunteering things that I did that I've maintained over time or considered to have been quite valuable. There's other volunteering that I've done that came and went, and there's a long list of it, but it's the ones that I enjoyed the most that I continue to do and continue to devote my time to. You know, when I did some of that first volunteering, I was busy doing a PhD and didn't have a lot of spare time. Then when I was doing my postdocs, I had some time, but not a ton of spare time. So I had to pick and choose which volunteering I wanted to maintain. And I maintained my postdoc volunteering and I maintained my chemistry outreach. But some of the other things I let go. I'm a father now, I have 2 boys, and so I have less time. And so I haven't added new volunteering as frequently. And when I do, I'm very cautious about it because things do take time. In general, the advice I've received is you should split your volunteering and your employment anywhere between 20% volunteering and 80% employment, or 10% volunteering and 90% employment. But that's different for universities because universities see a lot of the volunteering we do as academically valuable or academic growth, right? The job that I have requires me to occasionally write grants. And I may have alluded to the fact that part of the reason I'm happy to not be a PI is I don't love writing grants. As it happens, I still do write grants. I help PIs write industrial relations grants to get them funding to do something that will help increase the TRL of their technology. And I write grants for outreach so that outreach has enough money to buy chemicals and compounds and to buy the cameras, for example, that we bought. 3D cameras are not cheap. And so I wrote grants for those. And so it still happens, but you have to pick and choose the time that you're willing to do, and then pick and choose the things that you think are valuable. So to zero in on your question about how much time it takes, I don't think I would have been able to do a PMP certificate in the terms of the studying and the work if I'd been employed full-time at the time. But I was not. I was, I received, when I left Sensorio and the company that made the startup for the ISS, or that made the technology for the ISS, I received a package as I was leaving, and that package coincided with the birth of my son. And so I took a considerable length of time off on purpose and spent time with my son. And that's fantastic. I would advise that to everyone in the world when you become a parent. It's amazing. Take that time. You never get it back. But in that time, I also am the sort of person who likes to be doing something and challenging myself, and not getting any sleep and looking after a child and teaching them all of the many things they need to learn in the first year of their life is exhausting, but it's not what I would call intellectually exhausting. So it was during that time, well, slightly sleep deprived, that I did the sort of necessary studying to challenge the PMP exam. And that really involved mostly looking at it, organizing myself, brushing up on it. I'm a fairly quick learner. And as the project manager that I mentioned, that who'd been the project manager for the Canadarm and who sponsored me into the organization, he was proof and was willing to sign as proof that I had done enough project management to be eligible. So I used that time then, and that was sort of my intellectual challenge while I was raising my son in the first not quite year of his life that I managed to take on. Different way of looking at it, when I was postdoc doing brain-machine interfaces work, I was also the chair of the postdoctoral association at the McGill University, the APF, and sitting on the Senate and founding the chemistry outreach group. That was too much. And so really we need to find a balance for ourselves at what's appropriate. I probably had between 30 and 40% of my time was those volunteer organizations, leaving only 60 or 70% of my time for the research that I was doing. And my research started to suffer because of it. And I stopped being the chair at the Association of Postdoctoral Fellows because I had to make a choice. Do I want to continue to be the chair there? Or do I want to continue to do chemistry outreach? Or do I want to be a crappy postdoc? And one should never make the choice. When you choose to do a job, you have to make sure that you do it excellently. Don't do something half well. Do it well. And then it doesn't matter what job you choose, you'll be happy with yourself for doing that. And whatever extra time it gives you, you can then choose for volunteering. When I interviewed for the job I have currently, one of the things I asked them is, how much time as an academic institution are you going to allow me of mine to do whatever I want, whether it be personal growth or the courses that I like to teach at McGill or things like that. And they told me that they thought about 30% of my time could go towards personal growth and volunteering. That's a high number. And that sat well with me in my interview because it meant that I was aware that I really was going to be given a fair amount of time where I could still teach the courses that I teach at McGill. And actually, like I said, I picked up a third course this past year, teaching about intellectual property. And it meant I would be able to keep my outreach volunteering, and I would have some extra time for personal growth. And then during this past year, actually, in the pandemic, I didn't have as much time as I wanted because a lot of professors are very busy doing research and traveling and talking about their research during normal times. And then when they can suddenly no longer travel and talk about their research, they realize they have a bit of extra time, and they start thinking about whether or not their research is potentially patentable, and they contact me. So my office has actually had quite an increase in workload over the last year. And so I haven't really had that 30%, but I expect it will come and go. And I've been allowed to teach the courses that I'm teaching. I haven't needed to take very much time to go and do outreach because you can't really go and interact with people in person these days. But I guess the extra time that I have had to put into work because of the pandemic, I got because I'm not doing any chemistry outreach volunteering, or not very much. I've done some online, but not a lot in the past year. So it balances and it shifts. There might be times when my work is very low and light and I do a fair amount more personal growth. Maybe I'll get some other certificate or designation that I've decided is valuable. But decide in advance before you put that time in. Figure out exactly what's involved. You know, a PMP takes people sort of a year of work to get. If you want to put in a year of work to do that, go for it. And the people I know who have used it to find jobs, I haven't actually, I didn't need to, but I was started down that road, and so I figured I'd complete it because it's not a very good idea to start something and not finish. And the people I know who have that certificate have said it has helped them find work and done a very good job of doing so.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Okay. If there's no question coming up, I'd like to. Oh, actually, there is.
Yeah, yes, me. I have a question.
Okay, you want to go?
Yeah. So actually, I have one question. Like Chris, I just thought, because in academia, people will usually write papers, and so it's kind of like disclosure of inventions. So in this case, how are we gonna, do some patents to protect our intellectual properties?
So it's fairly easy to do, and this is part of my job. The professors that I work with, all of them or most of them know me well enough to know that they can either phone me or send me an email and say, I've got this paper that I'm writing, have a look and tell me if you think this is something that we should even submit as a disclosure to your office to see if it's patentable. And I'll have a look, and I can usually let them know within an hour, maybe two. Sometimes I need to meet with them to ask them some finer points about what it is that they're doing, just in case. And then if it's something that needs to be carefully examined to find out if there is any prior art, whether or not it's obvious or non-obvious. In general, things are novel if you're doing them as academic research. If it's able to be published, it's novel. But that doesn't mean it's non-obvious. Doesn't mean it hasn't been mentioned in prior papers or in other patents in a language that you don't read as a researcher. And so that non-obvious needs a very careful check. And we actually have a group in my department at McGill that focuses on specifically finding out whether or not something is patentable. Partly that just as a quick check for novelty, but researchers are very good at knowing what's novel. And then there's a more detailed check for non-obviousness. And so if I think that what they have is valuable and commercializable, I trust them that it's novel. And then I say, you know what, maybe let's hold off on submitting this paper while I find out if it's not obvious and we should patent it or not. Or sometimes I say, submit this paper, but let the editor-in-chief of the journal know that it's not to be publicly disclosed while we are sorting out whether or not we want to try and patent it. And that happens fairly often because it takes 2 to 3 months for us to do a full due diligence review and determine if something is patentable. And for those of you who publish papers, you're fairly familiar with it. Also takes an uncertain length of time between 1 and 5 months once you submit a manuscript to actually get it published. Those things can happen concurrently, so long as the editor-in-chief of the journal knows that if they decide to publish it and within a month, they should come back to whoever submitted the paper before they publish it and say, are you ready for us to publish it?
Okay, I see.
So it's realistically, it's not very hard to concurrently figure out if something is patentable before you disclose it. The problem is when researchers that I haven't had a polite talk with about letting me know as much in advance as possible say to me,
Yeah.
oh, I think that we would like to maybe patent this interesting work. I'm giving a talk at a conference in 2 weeks. 2 weeks is very hard for me to figure out if it's actually patentable or not. And that talk at a conference is a public disclosure, and therefore suddenly obvious. Anyone who hears that talk, and these days they're recorded so people can even go back and look at them and say, oh, well, I'm pretty sure that this was talked about here at this talk, so you can no longer patent.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's how that decision gets made, and it's not too complicated. And there are different countries have different grace periods as well. If you are the inventor and you disclose something in the United States and you only want to patent it in the United States, you actually have a year after your disclosure before you file that provisional patent.
Okay,
If you're an inventor in Canada or Mexico or Australia and maybe one other country, and you disclose something publicly and then you want to patent it, you have a year after that disclosure before you file your national patent. Okay. But if you want to patent something in Europe, you can never have disclosed it first. So careful, right? I'm not saying that disclosure is a bad idea. I'm just saying don't disclose something that you mean to patent Disclosing things is a perfectly fine idea. Dissemination of research is the bread and butter of academic research. But do so with your eyes open. Once you make that disclosure, it's no longer patentable. If you're okay with that, more power to you. Go and give what could be an incredibly well-received talk at an upcoming conference. Just do it with your eyes open.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Thank you.
No problem.
So yeah, I actually have a question for you, Chris. So you mentioned something about the teaching certificate at Western University. I'm actually also considering doing a similar thing at the U of T here, but I'm just not sure because it looks like it's gonna take some time to get the certificate or finish the program, and obviously it takes up the hours of your research work. So I'm not sure how worth you find it to be, and yeah, maybe you can say something about it.
So the way that I did my teaching certificate at Western was I started at Western and I worked for 6 months. I was fairly on track to demonstrate that the research I was doing was going to be good and patentable. In the end, because of a sort of, I'm not certain of all the politics involved, but we were politely asked not to publish it, which I disagree with. It was patented, it should have been publishable, but it was publishable. I mean, the manuscript got submitted and then got gently pulled back. So I had demonstrated that I was able to do the research and I was moving along well in my postdoc. And I went and asked my postdoc supervisor if I could take this course. And he said, sure, just don't let your work suffer. He perfectly honest guy. He's a great guy. He's the one who helped me realize that I didn't particularly want to be a PI. He told me in conversations, he's like, now that I am a PI, I realize I made some mistakes. I'm like, oh, well, why don't you go and do a different career? And he's like, because this is what I know best. I know how to do this well, and I'm very good at this. And now that I have a family and small children, I don't have the luxury of going and retraining and doing something else at this point in my life. I would not be surprised at all to learn once his family is older, once his kids are in university, that he quits as a prof and wants to go and do something else and just goes and does that. I hope he manages to, because I know at the time, maybe it's changed. Maybe he's happy with that now because this was a decade ago. But at the time, he really did not love being a prof, and he carefully explained why to me, and his arguments were quite valid. And I have acted as a professor before. I mean, I am a professor in the way I teach and write grants and things, but I am not a PI, and I don't want to be. And I've acted as one, and it is a lot more work, a lot more emotional and mental time than I want to put into my career. It does not allow for the freedom for me to also put 30% of my time into whatever volunteering I want to do. You know, a good friend of mine is a PI who was happy doing help with the chemistry outreach group when she arrived at McGill. She loved doing outreach and she was glad to see it was there. And for a couple of years, she did outreach and we've become friends, and she loves doing outreach. And very sadly, a couple of years ago, she came to me and said, I need to put more time into being a PI than I have been. And she's doing great as a PI, but she's like, I can't keep doing outreach. I don't have the time. It's not fair to my students. And so I like very much a job where I have 30% of my time I can go and do what I want. You know, a job where I have, being a good PI is a 90 to 100% of your time job. And that means you don't really have the opportunity to look and do other things until you're very established. And then you're looking at not only maybe tenure, but maybe even moving from an associate to a full professor before you really can say, okay, I'm going to relax, do a little bit less work and look into some either administrative work at the university or some volunteering, or sometimes PIs take a sabbatical year and found a startup on something they've invented. There's no way you can do that as a new PI. And so I would have been looking at trying to raise a family. That magical, wonderful year I had with my first son that I took off when he was born would be an unthinkable option if I had gone to be a PI, right? So establish yourself in what you're doing, prove to who you're working for that you're excellent at it, and then approach them and say, I'm pretty interested in this additional course that I think will help improve my teaching, which I want to work at. Are you comfortable with me taking that? And there you go. And if they say no, then there's other problems. But in general, for everyone that you work for, prove that you can do what you can do well, and they're happy to let you do other things.
That's good. Thank you.
Good luck. I should mention that I actually took a couple of short 3-day courses on teaching, on speaking to the public, on teaching science to children and things like that when I was at the ANU in Australia. But they didn't quite make the cut for today's limit to 1 hour presentation. So it's not like that's the first thing I did for improving my teaching, but it's the big certificate that's associated with it.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Amnahir, do you have anything to say, or shall we?
No, thank you so much for the talk. That was very interesting. I learned a lot.
And I'm happy to help people. So if you have questions for me in the future, or if people watch this video later on and have some questions, I won't be paying attention to the YouTube page, but Jen or Xiao or Amnahir, feel free to direct people who have questions to me. You can give them my email address if you wish, and I'll happily answer questions or talk with people. I like to be able to help. It's part of my enjoyment of my 30% of my time.
Yeah, we'll let you know, like forward their questions to you later if we receive any.
Yeah, please forward them to me by email, and I'll happily answer those questions or talk to the people about them.
Oh yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks so much for today's talk. It's
Awesome.
really informative.
Yeah.
Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Chris. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I think that should conclude it for today. Thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Chris, for the excellent talk. And thanks, Sam, here for the co-hosting, and Jen for making it happen. Okay, I guess, see you next time.
Yeah, see you.